moving on, I'm going to talk about my box changes for a bit. We're going to get into the actual meta stuff after moving on from that depressing topic of a depressing unit. So we can finally start talking about the actual meta in general. And in the initial testing period, I once again tried to fit Kruger into my style of play, and I even enchanted a Newton set to go with his exclusive to try and make use of his Suicide Bomber kit. So for Alicia, I got 2 copies, and after some preliminary testing, I felt that her damage was decent enough to be played, and I just had to get a feel for it in actual games, in casual and ladder. So I chose to drop CC White and Sigma to fit these 2 units in. Frankly, it's not like these 2 units are falling off or anything, but there's just too many decent units to go around right now and only 15 slots. So CC White I dropped just on a whim to try and see if my box would do fine with 1 healer, just to make more aggressive options. And Sigma because his value of counter killing stuff with his counter armor tag has been dropping recently. Usually you use counter armor to counter Pyra and Cherry, but Cherry nowadays almost everyone is running 1-up by now. So it was between him or Cherry to be dropped, but Cherry still retained better utility in the form of being a soft Wetham check, and also her kit of being able to hit and run, and also her stun utility. So Sigma still retains his long threat range versus stuff like Epsilon and drop near mages, but that's about it actually. So he doesn't have any self-sustain. He gets hit by 1 AoE, he's like basically crippled for the rest of the game, that sort of stuff. But yeah, basically his novelty of being a soft check to Cherry and Kyra has kind of diminished by now. And I think that the other assassins retain better value in the team. So after a few games, I quickly came to the conclusion that Kruger just wasn't really going to work in this style of play with my current box. It's the second time now, because last update I also tried to add in Kruger to combo with IBC. So I'll discuss this in a bit more detail later in the individual units section. But the short answer is I don't think you can just randomly splash him onto a predominantly single target playstyle and expect him to consistently work his magic. So I chose to take Sigma back over CC White because after playing those few games, I actually realized I don't miss her that much, and I simply prefer having Sigma back as an offensive option. Also more to be discussed later for CC White in particular. So finally, I just want to show what my final 15 unit box looks like, which is mostly what the average meta single target comp looks like, with Sigma, Ares, and Alicia being less favored overall in the meta. Other than that, it's mostly, it's kind of what you would expect to see in the ladder. So the general observed meta for this month, I always call month, but it's basically the 4 weeks of the current update. So it roughly looks something like this. So do take note that, as I've mentioned earlier, these are mainly derived from the games I've played on my account, my pilot accounts, and also some games that I've spectated. And it's not exactly an objective breakdown of Apex Arena in general. So not much to be said here actually, but I've chose to make the distinction between the different type of aggro boxes as compared to before, and I'll talk about some of these type of boxes in more detail. So the first one that I want to talk about is the aggressive hybrid box with a focus around IBC. So this was the best example I could find in my recent match history on my main, but I'm gonna make some slight changes to it to make it more ideal, which basically turns it into a hyper aggressive variant of this box. So you can tweak Hilda and Rosen to your liking if you wanna just steal this box. But anyways, this box focuses a lot around either first or second picking IBC, then you're just asking the other guy if they want to play against AoE or assassins. So facing against this box, depending on how you draft, you might end up giving something like Autocrator into IBC, into Kruger, into whatever is left, like either AoE or assassins. So bottom line is that this combination of DPS and playing around IBC presents like an extreme amount of versatility. So IBC's presence essentially means that there's not much distinction between the 3 mobility and 5 mobility units if you pick her early, and it's not like the box cannot function without her either. So If you choose to ban the 3 mobility units, they just pick their 5 mobility units like Helena and Wetham, Diehard. And you ban the long legs, well, the short legs are kind of long leg now anyway. And half of the AoE units can flex into single target, and no matter what, you'll be fighting into some combination of assassins and AoE. So they can either just play the usual trade game, or they can play this AoE and assassin mix, which is, you know, this dilemma is pretty hell for more balanced boxers. So personally, I think boxers that are more focused on single target would have a slight advantage going against this if you're familiar with the matchup, but only very slightly. The only concern I see for this box is that, you know, I don't play it, but I've played against it, is that they have a dilemma when they need to figure out their first ban. So whether they first ban Wetham or first ban Rosen. So like, you could just give Wetham and then you can give Rosen, and then Wetham and Helena can just pivot into single target, and then you can try to play the trade game after you allow them to pick the Rosen. But this sort of composition might run out of gas in such a matchup, because if they get Rosen, they'll probably just leave the Himiko and Ruger in, and they can kind of just ignore them until, you know, the end of the game. So you might not have enough units that can trade properly with a full single target team, even if they basically only have 4 DPSs because they pick Rosen. So the other box that I want to talk about a little bit is Heartstall. So this is actually a very uncommon playstyle. Like, I roughly gauged it at 5%, because every game is gonna last a fucking year, and you need very high invested units, so like full troops, full enchants, full everything to make it work. So the example that I use here is a pretty distinct one, and I think anyone that is in a similar ranking would be familiar with it. But I also don't think it's exactly the strongest variation of this box, but I don't have a good example on hand right now. But the idea is there. So it's just basically a shit ton of tanks with at least Rosen, Elma, and Liana to protect against like AoE rush and debuffs. Then the rest of the DPS are mostly geared to be assassin proof, because, you know, you counter single target by having a lot of tanks, you counter AoE by having a lot of healers, and then the rest of your units need to be at least decent against assassins. So if it's your first time going up against this kind of box with an aggressive box that somewhat lacks sustain, you'll probably not end up with the correct draft, and then you just get out sustained. But after you fight it a few times, hopefully you get a rough idea of what you need to do against it. Since most of the so-called assassin-proof DPS are actually AoE units, you know, Michelle, Bosa, I don't even know if I want to call Bosa assassin-proof, but there is that stupid Tiara build that you can go up to like 1k defense or something like that. Then, similarly to the last box, you'll run into a conflict of first banning Rosen versus first banning Werner. But I think if you play this style, you will have to ban Rosen, because most of the DPSs are primarily AoE. So you just ban the Rosen and you give the Werner, and you hopefully have enough gas to choke out the sustain on the other team and just whittle them down slowly. I don't know, I just wanted to give this style a spotlight for being in the complete opposite end of what most people are running right now, which just goes to show that you really can run anything as long as you know what you're doing with it. And no playstyle really ever gets completely phased out. Like, most playstyles, not all, I think, all playstyles will at least be somewhat viable unless you're playing at like a super high rank or you're super deep in playoffs. So I also wanted to, you know, use this section to talk a bit about a certain draft style that I've ran into way more than I would have liked. And it took me a while to figure it out. Like, seriously, I ran into a lot of this. So basically, it's a specifically against 1 tank and 1 to 2 healer boxes like what I'm running. So just Rosen and Hilda, which is what admittedly a lot of people are running right now. But the idea is that you give them the Hilda, the tank, and then you ban out the other forms of Dispel. And then you pick Wetham, and then you use his AoE to disable the tank. And you generally pair this with like long leg units. Like you can see Helena in this example here. And also IBC, technically she gets pretty long leg after using her formation, that traditionally would get blocked by tanks. So for those who are more familiar with my style, I generally favor banning Lucretia more on the first ban. So, I'm a bit stubborn, so I tried various things against this draft to see if there's anything I could do to, ease the matchup a little bit. And the conclusion that I came to was just simply ban Wetham if you want to play Hilda. Otherwise, don't bother picking the Hilda and just play the trade game, pick your trading units, don't bother with the tank. So technically, using Wetham to disable the tank kind of turns it into a 4v4 provided your other 4 units are DPSs, but also not really because Wetham is still rather difficult to kill, and anyone that gets clipped by his AoE basically won't be able to heal back because your sustain is already banned out. So this matchup forced me to re-evaluate the whole Lucretia versus Wetham debate, and sometimes you really just might be better off drafting for having the better threat range than your opponent. I think Lucretia shines more in situations where the fights are more skirmishy, like maybe it's a mix of short and long leg units, so maybe 2 units from each side would trade with each other, and then suddenly she has the superior threat range and the superior matchup in the 3 versus 3 after that. Whereas she's a bit more helpless in situations where their entire team just collapses on you on one turn. Like, she doesn't have enough time to counter kill everything, even if she's very strong in that department. So, which tends to be what these kind of Wetham lineups want to do. So at least with Lucretia, her whole hit and run thing kind of requires her to proc breeze. Like, you're scared of her getting breeze and then she just runs in, kills your unit, and then just stops back out with her puppet. And the minus cooldown from her puppet only really comes into play in the more dragged out games, like you can reuse the cooldown of your guard skill or of your faction buff, or just very high cooldown skill that you use to counter kill a unit. Whereas Wetham, you already know he's coming in no matter what, and God forbid that he clocks. So I'm not saying that Wetham is a straight up better ban than Lucretia, but I do think the scales have been tipped a little bit in favor of Wetham. So it just depends on, like, you need to figure out for different boxes what you want to ban basically. And for the last section of this video, I'm going to be discussing a little bit more about certain individual units like mentioned earlier. And I can't just reuse the same format as the first meta recap because the top tier meta units don't change that fast, and in fact some of them just straight up don't change even across like 5-6 seasons. So yeah, I'll be using this section to talk about some units that I've mentioned earlier, which is Kruger and CCY, and also some other units that I think aren't as common but are worth mentioning. So first off, we're gonna start with Kruger. He got his exclusive dispatch, which allows him to convert 2 buffs from anyone within 5 blocks of him when he dies, which complements his style of just diving in and causing a lot of disruption. And what I've realized in these 2 months is that you can't just toss him randomly into a primarily single target based team, which you could kind of do with Himiko. So in order to get consistent results from him, you need to at least be more willing to early pick IBC, which ties into the the hybrid box that I described earlier, or any other form of mobility support at least. Or you play him with other AoE units that are better equipped to initiate instead of playing Kruger to be the initiator. So the thing is, with Kruger's natural 3 mobility, it's almost impossible for him to be able to actually initiate first into most aggressive teams. So he's gonna get zoned by something that has more threat range by him, Wetham, Die Hard. Actually, he's not really that scared of Die Hard because most Krugers run Dropmere, but you get the idea. So then you're mostly just praying for an eventual 1-for-1 with his Dropmere Warlocks build against an Assassin or something like that, because it's really hard to get him in versus most long leg teams. So which brings me to my next point, which is Thorns is a build that was always kind of there for any mage that could carry Warlocks, but it became a bit more worthwhile to consider after IBC was dropped into the game, which reduces the need for him to proc the breeze himself. So with the Thorns proc, you can pretty much secure the kill on any physical range attacker if you proc it, and possibly even other things that don't carry nebulous rope, so even mages or like melee attackers. If you proc Thorns with Warlocks or Thorns with Dropmere, you might be able to counter kill those too. So I'm pretty sure even Epsilon with Nebulous Robe will just melt to a Taunt proc in addition to the Dropnir and Warlocks. But I think Pepsi versus Kruger is just a horrid matchup if the Kruger can touch him anyways, because he's gonna lose all his buffs. So the problem is when you run Taunts, you don't get any form of mobility boost, and then he's just stuck there scratching his ball sack because 3 different things on the enemy team outrange him. So you might want to keep Breeze on him and drop the whole Suicide Bomber thing. And finally, the last point, which is his exclusive is a helmet, which means that you can't run Tenuous Headdress if you want to run his exclusive. So it's a really good one that further enhances what he already does, but it doesn't fundamentally change the way that he plays. So even like his helmet choice is actually still debatable because Tenno Breeze is Tenno Wind. And at some point, if you're considering which helmet to use, you might even go one step further and consider whether you want to run him at all. But I can't give you an answer for that. You know, like I've tested it myself, it wasn't really for me, but it might work for you in that hybrid box that I, once again described earlier. So next up, I'm gonna move on to Sissy White, and I'll mostly just talk a bit about why I don't really miss her in my box after dropping her. So fundamentally, I think of her more as a support or utility hero rather than an actual healer. Mainly because her AoE healing capability is actually dog shit, because Inspire only has a 2x in multiplier as opposed to Mass Heal's 3x in multiplier, even though it doesn't have cooldown. So her Dispel is almost entirely reliant on Night Bloom, and Forest Priest is the other one, as Inspire only dispels 1 debuff. So God forbid you are an SSM believer and you watch your Inspire heal your DPS for 20%, which is not the most inspiring heal, I would say. So even though she can AoE heal every single turn, but you are healing jack shit every single turn and you're gonna die before that if you are fighting a full AoE team. So her kit carries a lot of different utility options, which are her summons, which is in her talent. She carries an Act Again, she carries mobility boost from Inspire, and she even has Dismiss, which kills off all enemy troops from a unit. And she can actually do that from a decent range, I recently found out. So the problem is that she doesn't really do all of them at the same time, and they're not particularly strong utilities either. So if you look at Inspire buffs mobility by 1 for anyone within 3 blocks, which is kind of nice, but sometimes it's not good enough to matter as you compare to a dedicated mobility buffer, like let's say Akaya or IBC. And then with her Act Again, it requires 5 coins, but it still has a 2 turns cooldown. If you compare her with the other Act Again healers, Liana can actually handle AoE and debuffs, and she's actually also able to use her Act Again on turn 1. Whereas Florentia, similarly, she can use her Act Again on turn 1, and even though it's tied to her having coins, she can spam it as long as she has enough coins, and there's no built-in cooldown into that. So even on the Act Again department, she misses out a bit. So Dismiss is a pretty unique skill, but it only really works in slower styles. You spend time, like you nuke their troops and then you just kill them with your assassins, or you nuke their troops so that they can never kill your units. And then her summons are also unique, but I don't find them mattering enough that she's so-called irreplaceable. So her cavalry can actually disable tanks in a similar way as Wetham, but I currently draft in a way that generally tends to ignore the tank anyways, so I rarely make use of it. Although I've been caught off guard by this more than like 2-3 times by now, because of how little I use her by myself. So her other useful summon, which is the Lancer summon, is cool, but there are more things that can ignore it than those who don't nowadays, like Magic ignores it, Assassins ignore it. Wetham doesn't really care, Helena doesn't really care, like she still does AoE. All in all, she just has a bunch of tools, but nothing really stands out other than the fact that she is versatile itself. And the last point is one of the real killers, because out of all the fancy things that she can do, she can only summon a tank on turn 1, or maybe use Inspire if you're lucky and proc her exclusive so that you start with 4 coins, with a heavy emphasis on the or, because she still can't do both. She can't Inspire and summon the Lancer tank on the same turn. And it's impossible to use her Act Again on turn 1 unless a summon dies somewhere on the map, like I don't know, you're running Matthew or some shit, or Akaya. So on top of her starting with 4 coins. So this kind of sucks in a meta game that is generally very aggressive, because like if you're a player 2, you're gonna have 3 different units face checking you even if you have a Lancer tank out, and she just kind of gets overwhelmed after that. So yeah, these would be the reasons on why I feel like I don't really miss her after kicking her out of the box. And I think having another DPS would give me a better value for that slot that I can vacate. So with those 2 out of the way, I can move on to the more niche units that have kind of surfaced recently, and the first one would be Landius. So Landius has been making his way back into boxes, I'm pretty sure just purely because he carries the Elias buff, in my opinion. Because, you know, if you look at this, Elias faction, like, this is the full Elias roster in the China server, so including all future units. So units that we currently have and are quite viable are highlighted in red, and the upcoming ones are in blue. I didn't mark Hobo because while I think he's actually still viable, I really haven't seen one in a really long time. And having said that, a lot of those that I didn't mark are actually really good in certain niche or playstyles. And you could pretty much make an entire box of Elias units if you wanted to, and have IBC cover the attack buff if Landius gets banned. Or even technically Sigma can carry the buff in a pinch if it doesn't hurt what he wants to do. Bottom line is that Elias faction good, Elias buffer kinda meh. As a tank, he's actually really frail by today's standards because most of his survivability actually comes from having his talent buff active and only having damage reduction versus range attacks. Having his revive tied to a passive also does him no favors, and I have unironically brought Blades of Freedom on Verna against Landius before and actually managed to one-shot him, although this was in a casual game. The revive being 20% also sucks because, you know, unlike Hilda or Christian's 50% revive. And as an example, a standard Spirit Boots Wetham with the Crush passive can kill a Landius from full HP with a normal attack, if he's missing his talent buff that got stripped from Annihilation in the previous turn, and if he's not using Guardian Infantry, which is a statement of how frail he is to physical attackers, physical melee attackers. But I guess to his benefit, he's still a beast at tanking magic, even in his Lancer form that has lower MDef. And he's generally able to stay up for a decent while even against multiple magic attackers, which is just about the only other good thing I can say about him other than being Elias buffer. So next up we have Juggler, which is kind of weird because we just discussed Landius, which are unironically the Season 1 meta tanks. And he's here because his 3C is actually still quite useful, and because his aquatic form actually synergizes with IBC, which gives him 5 mobility while actually still being able to tank shit, compared to Cavalry Juggler. So despite not having a revive, Juggler is still able to survive at least 1 hit from most DPSs, unless they are super decked out with a lot of damage increase. And even if I call him frail, he can actually still be borderline immortal against physical units if he's allowed to bring werewolves and has an actual healer behind him. And with werewolves, he can actually bite back on his normal attacks, or, you know, be shot. So the nice thing about him is that he fits into both offensive styles of play, with his Master of Ice effect doing chip damage, you know, slowing mobility by putting them in water, or just forcing out a healer move for AoE teams. And for single target teams, his Bishop effect for disabling the tanks. So I think he's definitely worth considering over or alongside Hilda if he fits into your style of play. And you would just think of him as a more bulky support DPS and not really expect him to stay alive for too long. So finally, we're down to the last unit, which is Emperor Lovina. So Lovina was a unit that I've favored since he was released. Like, I don't think he's meta or anything, but I saw a lot of potential in catching people off guard if they're not clear with how his teleport works. And even if they do, since he's been released for a while now, I still think his kit is pretty decent even without Surprise Factor. And mainly he forms a strong AoE support core with IBC, you know, mobility support core, because they boost mobility in different ways. So it makes the draft a bit more complicated because you can't just so-called, you know, ban the DPS and give all the supports like you used to be able to do with Akaya, Letitia, those kind of mobility support units. Because the support actually stack their buffs and they're actually still DPSs. So with Lovina, it helps the overall AoE team to facilitate a turn 1 engage with actual follow-up, even though he himself has to go the next turn because he only gets his mobility buff after teleporting friendly units. So it's not just a random Clotaire or Wetham running in on turn 1 without any actual follow-up. Now even if you try to run backwards, the Ares, Kruger or Vincent will be able to provide follow-up attacks, which is the strong suit of AoE Rush. They just bomb you without giving you time to fight back. So yeah, I forgot to move the slide, but his damage is actually deceptively strong if you just look at his attack stat. Because his attack stat is kind of low because he's equipping BB without his exclusive right now. But he has a ton of damage increase in his talent and also a huge multiplier on his 3C. So after that, you take even more fixed damage if you try to attack back right after tanking the AoE. It's been a while, but you can actually see him in action in one of my older replay videos that's titled like Die Hard is finally useful or something like that. And you can see my T just eating a fat 18k AoE from him, which also killed said Die Hard in that video. So finally, he can technically pivot into single target if the situation calls for it, but since he's carrying Balance Blade, it's not like horrific or anything. Mostly because his mobility support is still appreciated in single target comps, and Sword Soul is still Sword Soul. To dispel 5 buffs, it's still a 1.8 times multiplier attack. And he also carries a budget revive so that he can leverage his tempo a bit. You can kind of just put him in front against units that aren't able to kill through his second life and force an extra hit. And probably the only bad thing about him is that he really needs that 6 star because he gets +3 mobility at the final star. But honestly, if you bothered to invest into him at all, you might as well go all the way. And he also buffs protagonist, which is something that I eventually want to build towards as a box. A little bit of copium with that. And that's it. So that's the end of the video. So for the final section of the video, this time I covered niche units. On last video, I covered meta units. So I'm not sure what I'm going to be putting into this section for the future ones. So maybe I'll just talk about, like, I don't know, talk about the niche unit in my box, like Ares, like why I'm still running him. Or if I just find a certain unit interesting, I'll just put it there, I guess. But anyways, that's the end of this video, and I hope you learned something from it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.